Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again. I appreciate each and every one of you who takes the time to watch these stories. I know life can be overwhelming, and finding moments to listen to real experiences like these isn't always easy. Today, I want to share something that happened to a good friend of mine, someone I've known for several years now. We first met in the most ordinary way you could imagine, in a hotel lobby in Bangkok, both of us looking completely lost with our luggage, trying to figure out where the elevator was. He was this tall, distinguished British gentleman who looked like he'd stepped out of a business magazine, and I was just another traveler figuring out this incredible city. What started as a simple conversation about directions turned into a friendship, and over the years, he's shared stories with me that would make your heart race and break at the same time. Today, I'm going to tell you about Michael Turner and what happened to him when he thought he'd found love again in the most unexpected place. Picture this. You're scrolling through your phone, looking at photos of the woman you love, the woman you've been planning a future with, when suddenly you see something that makes your blood freeze. There she is, your beautiful girlfriend, but she's not alone. She's with another man in another house, living what appears to be a completely different life. The photo timestamp shows it was taken just 3 days ago while she was supposed to be visiting her sick mother. Michael Turner discovered these photos on a cloudy Tuesday afternoon in Bangkok, and what he found would shatter everything he believed about love, trust, and the woman he thought he knew. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you enjoy hearing real stories about people navigating the complexities of international relationships and the dark sides of romance that nobody talks about, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. These stories matter, and your support helps me continue sharing them. Michael Turner was 53 when this story began, a successful financial consultant from London who had spent the better part of his adult life building a career that demanded everything from him. His marriage to Sarah had lasted 22 years before cancer took her away, leaving him with a house that felt too big, memories that felt too heavy, and a future that seemed impossibly empty. For 3 years after Sarah's death, Michael threw himself into work with a kind of desperate intensity that only comes from trying to outrun grief. His colleagues noticed the longer hours, the weekend emails, the way he'd volunteer for business trips that would keep him away from London and the life he'd shared with his wife. His friends worried about him, but Michael had perfected the art of appearing fine while slowly drowning in loneliness. The idea of traveling to Thailand hadn't been his. His business partner, James, had practically forced him to take a real vacation, threatening to book the trip himself if Michael didn't. Bangkok was supposed to be a reset, a chance to experience something completely different from the gray London streets and the predictable rhythm of his daily routine. Michael arrived at Suvarnabhumi Airport on a humid evening in March, tired from the 14-hour flight but oddly energized by the chaos and vibrancy of the city. He'd booked a month-long stay, telling himself he'd explore, maybe take some cooking classes, visit temples, do all the things Sarah had always wanted them to do together but never had the chance. The hotel he'd chosen was in the Sukhumvit area, modern but not ostentatious, the kind of place where business travelers mixed with adventurous tourists. That first week, Michael discovered he was surprisingly adaptable to solo travel. He'd wake up early, explore different neighborhoods, get lost on purpose, and find his way back through the maze of streets and canals that made Bangkok feel like a living organism. The food was incredible, the people were kind, and for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like he could breathe without the weight of expectation or sympathy from people who knew his story. He was just another foreign visitor, anonymous and free to reinvent himself, even temporarily. It was during his second week, while sitting at a small cafe near Lumpini Park, that Michael first saw Supalak. She was working as a server, moving between tables with a grace that seemed almost choreographed, her smile genuine rather than the practiced politeness he'd encountered elsewhere. She was beautiful in a way that seemed effortless. Long black hair that caught the afternoon light, dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and a laugh that cut through the ambient noise of the busy cafe. When she approached his table, her English was accented but clear, and she asked about his book with what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than just professional politeness. Supalak was 28, though she carried herself with a maturity that suggested she'd experienced more of life than her years might indicate. She told Michael she was from a small town in northern Thailand, that she'd moved to Bangkok to support her family, and that she dreamed of eventually opening her own restaurant. Her story was both familiar and unique. The young woman from the provinces making her way in the big city, sending money home, sacrificing her own immediate happiness for the long-term welfare of people she loved. Michael found himself returning to the cafe every few days, not just for the excellent coffee, but for the brief conversations they'd share when she had a moment between customers. What started as polite exchanges about the weather and his impressions of Bangkok gradually became more personal. Supalak would ask about his work, his life in London, what had brought him to Thailand. Michael found himself sharing more than he'd intended, talking about Sarah, about the emptiness he'd been carrying, about how foreign his own life had begun to feel. Supalak listened with an attention that seemed completely genuine, asking follow-up questions that showed she was really hearing him, not just waiting for her turn to speak. She had a way of making him feel seen in a way he hadn't experienced since his wife's death. By his third week in Bangkok, Michael had completely reorganized his days around visits to the cafe. He told himself it was just friendship, just the natural human connection that can develop between strangers in foreign places, but he was beginning to acknowledge feelings he hadn't expected to experience again. Supalak seemed to enjoy their conversations as much as he did, and gradually their interactions extended beyond the cafe. She offered to show him parts of the city tourists rarely saw, taking him to local markets and street food stalls where she'd translate not just the language but the entire cultural context of what they were experiencing. Their first real date happened almost by accident. Michael had mentioned wanting to see a traditional Thai dance performance, and Supalak offered to take him to a small theater where her friend performed. They sat in the back row, sharing whispered explanations of the stories being told through movement and music, and Michael found himself watching Supalak as much as the performance. The way her face lit up when explaining the mythology, the unconscious way she moved her hands to echo the dancer's gestures, the comfortable silence that settled between them during the more contemplative pieces. When he walked her home afterward, the conversation flowed so naturally that they ended up talking until nearly 3 in the morning, sitting on the steps of her apartment building. The shift from friendship to something deeper happened gradually, then all at once. Michael extended his stay in Bangkok, telling James he needed another few weeks to fully decompress. Supalak began spending more time away from the cafe, showing Michael hidden corners of the city, introducing him to her friends, gradually weaving him into her daily life. She was affectionate but not pushy, interested in his past but focused on their present, and she had a way of making him laugh that reminded him of who he'd been before grief had redefined him. Michael felt himself falling in love with the intensity that was both thrilling and terrifying. But even in those early days of romance, there were small things that didn't quite add up. Supalak's phone would ring at odd hours, and she'd step away to take calls, speaking in rapid Thai that Michael couldn't follow. Sometimes she'd mention places she'd been or things she'd done that seemed inconsistent with her story of being a small-town girl working to support her family. Her apartment was nicer than what he'd expect someone in her financial situation to afford, and she had jewelry and clothes that suggested either very generous tips or an additional source of income she hadn't mentioned. Michael pushed these observations aside, telling himself that everyone had complexities and that his perspective as an outsider might be skewing his interpretation of perfectly normal circumstances. The intensity of their relationship escalated quickly. Within 6 weeks of meeting, Supalak had essentially moved into Michael's hotel room, though she maintained her apartment and continued working at the cafe. They talked about the future with the kind of hopeful planning that new couples engage in, discussing the possibility of Michael returning to Bangkok more frequently, of Supalak eventually visiting London, of finding ways to bridge the geographical and cultural distances between their lives. Michael had never expected to feel this way again, and the combination of unexpected love and exotic setting made everything feel heightened and magical. It was during this period of intense romance that the first real warning signs appeared. though Michael was too intoxicated by the relationship to interpret them clearly. Supalak began asking more detailed questions about his financial situation, his property in London, his business interests. She framed these conversations as natural curiosity about his life and future security, but there was a probing quality that made Michael occasionally uncomfortable. She also started mentioning financial pressures more frequently: her mother's medical bills, her younger brother's school fees, unexpected expenses that seemed to crop up with concerning regularity. Michael wanted to help. He was financially comfortable, and the amounts Supalak mentioned weren't significant enough to impact his lifestyle. When she mentioned her mother needing an expensive medical procedure, he offered to send money without hesitation. When her brother's university required additional fees, Michael transferred the funds before Supalak had finished explaining the situation. Each time she was grateful but not effusive, accepting his help with a mixture of relief and what seemed like genuine reluctance. This pattern of financial assistance began to feel normal, even virtuous. Michael told himself he was doing what any caring partner would do, supporting the woman he loved through temporary difficulties. As their relationship deepened, Supalak began sharing more dramatic stories about her past and her family's circumstances. Her father had abandoned them when she was young, leaving her mother to raise 3 children alone. Her younger sister had gotten involved with dangerous people and needed money to get out of a bad situation. Her brother was brilliant but couldn't afford to continue his education without help. Each story was compelling and emotionally resonant, and each one seemed to require financial intervention. Michael found himself sending increasingly larger amounts of money, not just to Supalak directly, but to various family members facing different crises. The emotional manipulation was subtle but effective. Supalak never directly asked for money. Instead, she'd share her worries and fears, allowing Michael to offer help as if the idea had originated with him. She'd express gratitude but also anxiety about accepting his generosity, which made Michael more insistent about providing support. She created a dynamic where helping her financially felt like proof of his love and commitment, while any hesitation on his part seemed selfish and unloving. Michael began to equate his financial contributions with the depth of his feelings, and Supalak's acceptance of his help with her trust in their relationship. By his third month in Bangkok, Michael had extended his stay indefinitely and was seriously considering permanently relocating to Thailand. He developed a routine that revolved entirely around Supalak: mornings at cafes while she worked, afternoons exploring the city or relaxing at his hotel, evenings together discussing their future. He'd transferred thousands of pounds to address various family emergencies, and he was beginning to look into property purchases and investment opportunities in Bangkok. The idea of returning to London felt increasingly unappealing, not just because of his relationship with Supalak, but because this new life felt more authentic and purposeful than anything he'd experienced in years. It was during this period of total immersion in their relationship that Michael began to notice inconsistencies that were harder to rationalize. Supalak would disappear for entire days, claiming family obligations that she couldn't fully explain. Her stories about her past began to shift slightly, with details changing or new information emerging that contradicted earlier conversations. She had expensive items that appeared without explanation, and she demonstrated knowledge about places and experiences that didn't align with her claimed background. Most concerning, she began to exhibit a level of financial sophistication that seemed inconsistent with someone who'd grown up in poverty and worked service jobs. The truth began to unravel on a Tuesday afternoon when Michael was alone in his hotel room, waiting for Supalak to return from what she described as a visit to her sick mother in a nearby province. He'd been using her laptop to check his email when a notification popped up for a photo-sharing application he wasn't familiar with. Curious and slightly concerned that someone might be trying to access her accounts, he clicked on the notification expecting to help her address a potential security issue. Instead, he found himself looking at hundreds of photos that documented a life he'd never seen or heard about. The photo showed Supalak in settings Michael didn't recognize, with people he'd never met, engaged in activities that contradicted everything he believed about her daily existence. There were photos of her in expensive restaurants with well-dressed men, pictures of her in luxury cars, images of her in beautiful homes that were definitely not the modest apartment she'd shown him. The timestamps on these photos covered the entire period of their relationship, including dates when she'd told him she was working at the cafe or dealing with family emergencies. In some photos, she was wearing jewelry and clothes that cost more than most people in Thailand earned in a year. But the most devastating discovery was a series of photos showing Supalak with another foreign man, someone who appeared to be in his 60s, in what was clearly an intimate relationship. They were holding hands, kissing, sharing meals in romantic settings. The photos spanned several months and showed a level of intimacy and commitment that mirrored exactly what Michael thought he had been building with her. In several images, they appeared to be at the same locations where Michael and Supalak had shared what he'd believed were special, unique moments together. The man in the photos was well-dressed and expensive-looking, the kind of person who could afford the lifestyle the photos documented. Michael spent hours going through the photos, each image adding another layer to a devastating revelation. Supalak wasn't just living a double life. She was living multiple lives with multiple men, maintaining several relationships simultaneously while extracting financial and emotional resources from each. The family emergencies that had prompted his financial support appeared to be fabricated, part of a systematic approach to manipulating generous foreign men who were lonely and vulnerable in a country where they didn't understand the cultural context well enough to identify deception. The photo evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. There were screenshots of banking transactions, photos of expensive purchases, images of properties and vehicles that suggested an income far beyond what any cafe server could earn legitimately. There were even photos of Supalak with groups of other young Thai women in settings that suggested they were comparing strategies or celebrating successful manipulations. The entire enterprise appeared to be organized and collaborative, with Supalak as one participant in a larger operation targeting emotionally vulnerable foreign men. Michael felt physically sick as the scope of the deception became clear. Every conversation they'd shared, every intimate moment, every expression of love and commitment had been calculated and false. The woman he'd fallen in love with didn't exist. She was a carefully constructed persona designed to extract maximum financial benefit from men like him. The family members he had been supporting were probably fictional, the emergencies manufactured, the gratitude and reluctance completely artificial. He'd been living in an elaborate performance where he was simultaneously the audience and the victim. If you're finding this story as shocking as I did when Michael first told me about it, you're not alone. These kinds of elaborate deceptions are more common than most people realize, especially targeting older men who are dealing with loss or loneliness. Have you or someone you know ever encountered anything similar? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're enjoying these real-life stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Your support helps me continue bringing these important stories to light. The immediate aftermath of Michael's discovery was a blur of anger, humiliation, and disbelief. His first instinct was to confront Supalak immediately, to demand explanations and express his rage at being so thoroughly deceived. But as the initial shock subsided, he realized that direct confrontation might not be the safest approach. If Supalak was part of an organized operation, there could be other people involved, potentially dangerous people who wouldn't appreciate their scheme being exposed. Michael's anger was mixed with a growing fear about how deep this deception went and what the consequences might be for discovering it. When Supalak returned that evening, Michael had to summon every ounce of self-control to behave normally. She greeted him with the same affection and apparent joy that had characterized their entire relationship, asking about his day, sharing stories about her supposed visit with her mother, planning their activities for the following day. Watching her perform this elaborate deception while knowing the truth was nauseating for Michael. Every smile felt like a lie, every touch felt like a violation, every expression of love felt like mockery. He managed to get through the evening by claiming fatigue and going to bed early, but sleep was impossible. Over the next few days, Michael began to notice things he'd previously overlooked or rationalized. Supalak's phone activity was constant and secretive, with multiple devices and what appeared to be several different social media accounts. She received expensive deliveries that she claimed were gifts from grateful customers at the cafe, explanations that now seemed obviously false. Her schedule was more erratic than he'd realized, with frequent unexplained absences that she attributed to family obligations or work requirements. Most disturbing, she occasionally demonstrated knowledge about his personal information that he was certain he'd never shared with her. Michael realized he needed to be strategic about extricating himself from the situation. Simply disappearing might prompt Supalak and her associates to escalate their efforts to maintain contact and continue extracting money from him. Confronting her directly could be dangerous if there were other people involved in the operation. He needed to document everything he discovered, secure his financial accounts, and find a way to leave Thailand without creating additional problems for himself. The romantic adventure that had felt like a new beginning was transforming into a nightmare that required careful navigation. The emotional impact of the discovery was as devastating as the financial implications. Michael had allowed himself to believe in love again, to imagine a future that included partnership and companionship and shared adventures. Discovering that those feelings had been manufactured and exploited left him questioning his own judgment and his ability to trust his instincts about people. The grief he'd been carrying from Sarah's death was now complicated by a new layer of loss and betrayal that felt almost worse because it had been deliberately inflicted. Michael began to research similar scams online, discovering that his experience was part of a well-documented pattern of fraud targeting older Western men in Southeast Asian countries. The operations were sophisticated, involving multiple participants playing different roles, with careful attention to psychological manipulation and emotional exploitation. Victims were typically men who were dealing with divorce, death of a spouse, or other major life transitions that left them emotionally vulnerable and financially comfortable. The scammers were skilled at identifying and exploiting these vulnerabilities while maintaining plausible cover stories. The financial damage was significant but not devastating for someone in Michael's position. He calculated that he'd transferred approximately £20,000 to various accounts over the 3 months of their relationship, amounts that were painful but wouldn't destroy his financial security. More concerning was the potential for ongoing exploitation if he didn't handle his departure carefully. Supalak and her associates might attempt to maintain contact, create new emergencies requiring financial support, or even escalate to blackmail if they had compromising photos or information about their relationship. Michael spent a week planning his exit strategy while maintaining the pretense of normalcy with Supalak. He told her he'd received word that his business required his immediate return to London, a story that would explain his sudden departure without suggesting he'd discovered her deception. He arranged to transfer his hotel payments to a different account and made sure his UK financial institutions were aware of potential fraudulent activity from Thailand. He also researched legal options for reporting the fraud, though he understood that pursuing criminal charges across international boundaries would be complicated and probably ineffective. The most difficult part of the process was managing his own emotions. Michael felt angry at Supalak and her associates, but he also felt angry at himself for being so easily deceived. He felt embarrassed about sharing the story with friends and family, knowing that many people would wonder how someone intelligent and experienced could be so thoroughly manipulated. He felt sad about losing what he'd believed was a meaningful relationship, even though he now knew it had never been real. Most of all, he felt profoundly alone in a way that was different from the loneliness he'd experienced after Sarah's death. On his last evening in Bangkok, Supalak suggested they have dinner at a restaurant where they'd shared their first official date. Michael agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to say goodbye without revealing what he'd discovered. Throughout the meal, she was charming and affectionate, talking about missing him while he was away and making plans for his return. She gave him a small gift, a traditional Thai amulet that she claimed would protect him during his travels and remind him of their love. Watching her perform this elaborate deception while knowing the truth was both fascinating and horrifying for Michael. When they returned to the hotel that final night, Supalak was more passionate and attentive than she'd been in weeks. as if she sensed something changing and was trying to reinforce her hold on him. Michael went through the motions of responding to her affection, but internally he felt completely disconnected from the experience. He was participating in the final scene of an elaborate play where he was both the audience and the unwitting star, knowing that everything happening was scripted and false, but unable to break character without potentially dangerous consequences. Michael left Bangkok early the next morning while Supalak was still sleeping, leaving a note explaining that he'd received an emergency call requiring his immediate departure. He promised to be in touch once he'd handled his business crisis and expressed love and gratitude for their time together. Writing those words felt like participating in his own deception, but he knew that maintaining the illusion was the safest way to extract himself from the situation. At the airport, he felt a mixture of relief and profound sadness, grateful to be escaping but mourning the loss of something he'd believed was real. The flight back to London was the longest 14 hours of Michael's life. He had no distractions from the thoughts cycling through his head, no external demands to prevent him from processing what had happened to him. He felt humiliated by how completely he'd been deceived, angry at Supalak and her associates for their manipulation, and deeply sad about the loss of what he'd thought was a genuine connection. He also felt a strange kind of gratitude that he'd discovered the truth before the deception had gone on longer or cost him more money. The whole experience felt surreal, like something that happened to other people in cautionary tales rather than something he could have lived through himself. Returning to his empty house in London was jarring after 3 months in Bangkok. Everything looked exactly as he'd left it, but Michael felt completely changed by his experience. The familiar surroundings that had once felt comforting now felt oppressive, reminders of the grief and loneliness that had driven him to seek connection in a foreign country. He found himself missing not Supalak, but the version of himself that had existed during those first weeks in Bangkok when he'd believed in the possibility of love and adventure and new beginnings. Michael spent weeks processing his experience, reading everything he could find about romance scams and emotional manipulation. He learned that his reaction was typical. Victims often felt more ashamed than angry, more focused on their own gullibility than on the criminals who had exploited them. He discovered that many people in similar situations never reported the crimes because of embarrassment and the low likelihood of recovery or prosecution. He began to understand that his experience, while personally devastating, was part of a much larger pattern of exploitation that affected thousands of people every year. The healing process was complicated by the fact that some of his feelings had been real, even if Supalak's responses had been manufactured. He had genuinely fallen in love, experienced joy and hope and excitement about the future. Those emotions couldn't be dismissed as false just because they'd been manipulated and exploited. Michael had to learn to separate his authentic feelings from the fraudulent relationship, to honor his own capacity for love while accepting that it had been weaponized against him by someone who viewed him as a source of income rather than a potential partner. Gradually, Michael began to rebuild his life in London with a deeper understanding of his own vulnerabilities and needs. He started therapy to process both his grief over Sarah's death and his experience with Supalak, recognizing that he'd been trying to use romantic love to solve problems that required different kinds of healing. He reconnected with friends he'd neglected during his months of intense focus on work and his subsequent escape to Thailand. He began to engage with activities and communities that provided social connection without the pressure and risk of romantic involvement. Michael also made the difficult decision to report his experience to both British and Thai authorities, knowing that prosecution was unlikely but hoping his information might help protect other potential victims. He discovered that Supalak was known to law enforcement and had been involved in similar schemes with other foreign men, though building cases against these operations was challenging because victims were often too embarrassed to cooperate, and evidence was difficult to gather across international boundaries. Michael's willingness to share his story and provide documentation was appreciated by investigators, even though he was told not to expect significant legal consequences for the perpetrators. More importantly, Michael began to find ways to use his experience to help others. He connected with support groups for fraud victims and discovered that sharing his story helped other people feel less alone and ashamed about their own experiences. He learned that romance scams were becoming increasingly sophisticated and common, targeting people at vulnerable moments in their lives with precisely calibrated emotional manipulation. His story, while personally painful, became a way to educate others about the warning signs and emotional tactics used by these criminals. Over time, Michael's perspective on his experience evolved from shame and anger to a more complex understanding of human vulnerability and resilience. He recognized that his capacity to love deeply and trust completely, while it had made him vulnerable to exploitation, was also one of his greatest strengths. The challenge wasn't to become cynical or closed off, but to learn to protect himself while remaining open to authentic connection. He began to see his experience not as a personal failure, but as an encounter with sophisticated criminals who had spent years perfecting techniques for exploiting basic human needs for love and companionship. Today, Michael has built a life in London that includes meaningful work, genuine friendships, and carefully considered romantic relationships. He's never returned to Thailand, though he doesn't rule out international travel in the future. He's learned to trust his instincts while also being more cautious about situations that seem too good to be true or relationships that develop very quickly. Most importantly, he's learned that healing from betrayal and manipulation takes time, but it's possible to rebuild trust in oneself and others without becoming bitter or closed off from human connection. Michael's story serves as a powerful reminder that anyone can become a victim of sophisticated fraud, regardless of their intelligence, education, or life experience. The criminals who run these operations are skilled psychologists who understand exactly how to identify and exploit human vulnerabilities. They target people at moments of transition and loneliness, offering exactly what their victims most need and want. The shame that victims feel often prevents them from seeking help or reporting crimes, which allows these operations to continue affecting other people. If you've been touched by Michael's story, whether because you've experienced something similar yourself or because you're concerned about protecting yourself or others from these kinds of scams, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel and share this video with people who might benefit from hearing it. Leave a comment letting me know your thoughts, and if you've had experiences with romance scams or other forms of manipulation, consider sharing your story to help others feel less alone. These conversations are difficult but necessary, and every person who speaks up makes it a little easier for the next victim to seek help and healing. Remember, falling for a sophisticated scam doesn't make you stupid or weak, it makes you human. And there's always a path forward, even from the deepest betrayal.